Imagine walking through the forests of northern Michigan and finding a hole in the ground. Not a modern mine, not a natural cave. A mine dug thousands of years ago. Beside it, you find heavy stone hammerstones, broken copper, and traces of ancient activity buried beneath centuries of soil. Now imagine discovering hundreds of these pits scattered across an island in the middle of Lake Superior. The strange part is not simply their age. It is what they tell us about North America. Because long before European explorers arrived, indigenous people were already extracting native copper from the earth. And they were doing it thousands of years before the rise of the civilizations most people associate with ancient metallurgy. So who were these miners? How did they discover the copper? How far did their copper travel? And why did this ancient industry eventually fade from the archaeological record? The answers are more complicated than the legends. And some of the biggest questions are still open. The story begins around the western Great Lakes. Today, this region is divided between the United States and Canada. But beneath its forests, cliffs, and enormous freshwater lakes lies something unusual. Native copper. Unlike copper or that must be processed to separate the metal from other minerals, native copper can occur as relatively pure metallic copper in the rock itself. And in the Keweenaw Peninsula of Michigan, and on nearby Isle Royale, nature placed enormous amounts of it within reach of the surface. The geology responsible for this began more than 1 billion years ago. Ancient volcanic activity created layers of rock that eventually became one of the world's great concentrations of native copper. Then came the glaciers. For thousands of years, massive ice sheets covered the Great Lakes region. When the ice finally retreated, it exposed a dramatically transformed landscape, and eventually humans entered it. Archaeological evidence shows that indigenous peoples in the western Great Lakes were using copper at least 8,000 years ago, with some recent archaeological research suggesting that copper tool production may have begun around 8,100 radiocarbon years ago. That would make this one of the earliest known traditions of metal tool production anywhere in the world. But there is an important distinction. These early people were not operating industrial mines. They were small, mobile hunter-gatherer communities. They did not have blast furnaces. They did not need them. The copper they encountered was already metallic. And that changed everything. Instead of smelting they could physically remove copper from exposed deposits. They could hammer it, shape it, cut it, and turn it into useful objects. But how did they discover it in the first place? That is where the mystery begins. One possibility is surprisingly simple. They found it lying on the surface. Glacial activity had exposed copper-bearing rocks, and pieces of native copper could sometimes be found near the ground. A bright metallic object in a landscape dominated by stone would have been impossible to ignore. At first, people may simply have collected pieces they encountered naturally. Then they discovered something more important. The copper did not stop at the surface, continued into the rock. And once people realized that, the landscape itself became a map. A visible copper fragment could lead to a vein. A vein could lead to a larger mass. And a larger mass could justify digging. What happened next? The tools were remarkably simple. Archaeologists have found stone hammerstones associated with ancient mining areas. The miners could use rounded stones to strike exposed copper-bearing rock and break away surrounding material. The result was a landscape of pits and depressions. Some were shallow. Others became more substantial. At Isle Royale, more than 1,000 indigenous mining pits have been identified. Many are now almost invisible beneath vegetation. But beneath the forest floor is evidence of an ancient industry. And that word, industry, needs to be handled carefully. It does not mean factories. It does not mean armies of workers. It does not mean a centralized kingdom controlling the mines. In fact, the archaeological evidence suggests something very different. People likely moved through the region seasonally. They hunted, they fished, they gathered plants. And during those movements, they could also obtain copper. Mining may have been integrated into their broader way of life rather than separated from it. That creates another mystery. If the miners were mobile communities, why make the dangerous journey to places like Isle Royale? The answer may lie in the copper itself. Copper was useful. It could be shaped into points, knives, tools, beads, ornaments, and other objects. And it could travel. Archaeologists have found Great Lakes copper artifacts far from the original mining districts. Research has even identified evidence of exchange networks connecting the Great Lakes with regions much farther away. One study of late archaic sites found evidence consistent with connections between Great Lakes communities and the coastal southeast. So the copper was not necessarily staying where it was mined. It could move through networks of people. And that means the ancient mines were not isolated places. They may have been part of a much larger social world. But who exactly were the miners? This is where popular stories sometimes take a dramatic turn. Over the years, theories have appeared claiming that Europeans, Vikings, Celts, Egyptians, Phoenicians, or some other mysterious old world civilization must have discovered the mines. The idea sounds exciting, but archaeology does not support it. The artifacts and mining remains found at the prehistoric sites correspond to indigenous North American technologies and cultural traditions. The National Park Service notes that the pre-contact artifacts from the Keweenaw and Isle Royale are indigenous in origin and do not match European artifacts. There is no accepted archaeological evidence that an old world civilization created the ancient copper mines of the Great Lakes. The real mystery is much more interesting. It is indigenous. But exactly which communities were responsible at different points in time? That question is much harder. The region was occupied by different cultural groups over thousands of years. Archaeologists can identify changing traditions through artifacts, tools, ceramics, settlement patterns, and other evidence. But a mine itself does not always tell us the name of the people who dug it. A pit cannot introduce itself, and many of the people who created these landscapes left no written records. Instead, archaeologists reconstruct their history from fragments. A hammerstone here, a copper point there, a buried layer, a piece of organic material, a campsite, a burial, and sometimes those fragments provide extraordinary clues. One of the most important archaeological developments has been radiocarbon dating. Researchers have analyzed organic material associated with copper artifacts and mining contexts. A 2021 study examining dozens of radiocarbon dates concluded that the old copper complex represents one of the oldest known metalworking traditions in the world. Some dates associated with copper artifacts reach back roughly 8,500 calendar years. But even here, there is a complication. Dating an artifact is not always the same as dating the moment when a mine was actively used. Organic material can become buried later. Mine pits can fill with soil long after miners leave. And that means some apparently ancient mine dates may actually record abandonment or later infilling rather than the moment of extraction. So even the timeline has uncertainties. And this is one of the reasons the story remains so fascinating. The deeper archaeologists look, the more complicated it becomes. Consider Isle Royale. The island sits in Lake Superior, separated from the mainland by cold, dangerous water. Thousands of years ago, reaching it required a serious journey. Yet people repeatedly made that journey. Archaeological evidence indicates copper mining on the island began thousands of years ago. At Minong, one of the largest known prehistoric mining landscapes on Isle Royale, archaeologists have documented a remarkable concentration of ancient pits. The site eventually became so important that the Minong Copper Mining District was designated a National Historic Landmark. And there is another layer to the story. Minong is the Ojibwe name for Isle Royale. For Anishinaabe peoples, the island is not simply an archaeological site. It is part of a much older cultural landscape. The Grand Portage Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa maintains traditional connections with Minong, including fishing, hunting, gathering, spiritual practices, and other cultural traditions. And indigenous oral traditions preserve stories connected to the island. One Ojibwe narrative recorded by a Jesuit missionary described Minong as an island associated with copper. Another tradition described islands made of copper. These stories should not be treated as archaeological reports. They belong to a different category. They are cultural traditions. They can help us understand how places were remembered and understood, but they cannot by themselves prove exactly when a mine was created or which prehistoric community dug it. And that distinction matters, because the archaeological evidence and indigenous traditions can illuminate different parts of the story. One tells us about physical remains. The other can preserve cultural memory and meaning. But there is still one enormous question. How much copper was actually produced? For decades, some estimates became famous for suggesting that ancient miners extracted astonishing quantities of copper from the Great Lakes. One older estimate proposed hundreds of thousands of tons. That number has been repeated in books, documentaries, and online theories. But the estimate has been challenged. Researchers have pointed out that some earlier calculations relied on assumptions about the size and depth of ancient workings that may not be reliable. Modern archaeology is much more cautious. Rather than simply asking, how many tons were removed? Researchers are asking more precise questions. Where did production happen? What waste was left behind? What tools were used? How was copper processed? Where did the finished objects go? And how were people organized across the landscape? Recent research has begun to answer some of these questions. A 2026 study examined copper production evidence from hundreds of sites across the northern Lake Superior Basin. The researchers found patterns suggesting that copper production was not one simple activity. Different stages could happen in different locations. People could obtain copper near the source and later continue working it elsewhere. This fits a seasonal pattern of movement across the landscape. And suddenly, the ancient mines look different. They were not necessarily giant monuments created by an unknown civilization. They may have been nodes in a flexible network. People moved. Copper moved. Knowledge moved, and technology changed. But then something happened. The intensity of the ancient copper tradition eventually changed. The reasons are not completely understood. Climate shifted, communities changed, technology changed, trade networks changed, and new cultural traditions emerged. The archaeological record does not give us one dramatic moment when someone simply declared, "The copper mines are closed." Instead, it shows a long and complicated history. Copper use continued for thousands of years. Different indigenous societies encountered the metal and used it in different ways. Eventually, European explorers entered the Great Lakes, and they noticed the copper too. In the 17th century, French explorers learned about the region's native copper from indigenous peoples. European attempts to exploit the deposits initially struggled. Centuries later, everything changed. By the 19th century, industrial mining companies were transforming the Keweenaw Peninsula. And here is one of the strangest twists in the entire story. Modern miners sometimes used ancient indigenous mining pits as clues. The old miners had already discovered where the copper was. European and American prospectors were, in some cases, following their trail. The ancient landscape became a guide to the modern mining industry. And the same copper-rich geology that attracted indigenous miners thousands of years earlier eventually helped create one of America's major 19th-century mining regions. But the old pits remained, silent, overgrown, easy to mistake for natural depressions, until archaeologists began studying them systematically. And perhaps that is the greatest mystery of all. For thousands of years, people came to these places. They crossed enormous lakes. They searched through forests. They struck stone against rock. They extracted metal. They shaped it. They traded it. Then they left. And the landscape waited. Today, we know far more than people did a century ago. We know that indigenous peoples were mining native copper in the Great Lakes thousands of years ago. We know they developed sophisticated techniques for working naturally occurring metal without the smelting systems associated with later Old World metallurgy. We know copper objects traveled beyond the mining districts. We know ancient production sites can be found across the Lake Superior Basin. And we know that places such as Keweenaw and Isle Royale preserve some of the oldest evidence of metalworking in North America. But we still do not know everything. We do not know exactly how the earliest miners first recognized the potential of copper. We do not fully understand how different communities organized mining over thousands of years. We cannot trace every piece of copper from mine to finished object. And in many cases, we cannot attach a specific cultural identity to the individuals who dug a particular prehistoric pit. Perhaps future excavations will change that. New dating techniques may reveal older mines. New chemical analyses may trace copper artifacts back to their sources. And new archaeological surveys may uncover settlements hidden beneath forests, wetlands, or the modern landscape. The story may become clearer, or it may become even stranger, because the ancient copper mines of the Great Lakes do not point to a lost European civilization. They point somewhere much closer to home. They point to indigenous societies that experimented with one of Earth's most remarkable materials thousands of years before the arrival of Europeans. And perhaps the greatest mistake is assuming that a mystery has to involve a lost civilization to be extraordinary. Sometimes the real mystery is realizing that the past was far more sophisticated than we imagined. Thousands of years ago, somewhere beside the cold waters of Lake Superior, someone picked up a piece of shining metal. They struck it with a stone, and discovered that the earth itself could be shaped. We may never know that person's name, but the pits they left behind are still there, waiting beneath the trees. So the next time you hear the phrase, ancient copper mines of America, remember the question is not simply who built them. We already know the broad answer. The deeper question is this: how much did the people who created this ancient copper world really understand about the landscape around them, and how much of that knowledge disappeared when they were gone?